December 24, 1944. A cold Texas night that smelled of mesquite and brisket, not of fear. Carl Weiss stood in formation beneath the weak arc of floodlights, the barbed wire looping like a frozen crown against the starless sky. Around him, 4,000 German soldiers shifted in their boots, breath steaming into the darkness in white puffs. They had been taught, for years, to expect humiliation and brutality from the enemy. They had been taught to believe that Americans were monsters with plenty to waste and nothing to lose. Instead, somewhere beyond the watchtower, a guitar was being tuned. Someone laughed, and the air carried the unmistakable, mouth-watering scent of roasting meat. What does an enemy do when offered a seat at the table? That question rode the smoke in the music that night. It is the first image of this story, the shock of a simple invitation issued by American officers at Camp Hearn in West Texas and received by men who had never imagined kindness from the people they had been taught to hate. The invitation was ordinary in one sense, a Christmas barbecue arranged by officers to feed the guards and staff. But it became extraordinary when Major William Todd suggested the prisoners be included. When Captain Jack Rowland and Sergeant Billy Jenkins crossed, in planning and spirit, the line that normally separated captor from captive. For the men gathered behind the wire, a gate opened. For a handful of hours on Christmas Eve, the war receded into a ring of light, the tasting of food and the sound of a harmonica playing Silent Night. If that opening image arrests attention, the story that follows asks us to understand how that small rupture happened and why it mattered. To do that, we must backtrack to the day these men arrived at Camp Hearn, to the routines that softened the edge of captivity, to the daily details that turned propaganda into incredulous reality. Camp Hearn stood under a wide Texas sky, a smattering of whitewashed barracks arranged in neat rows around a central parade ground, flanked by a watchtower and its unavoidable coil of barbed wire. It was one of many camps in the United States that housed German prisoners of war after 1943. According to camp records, the United States held hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners during the war, and Texas alone sheltered tens of thousands. Precise tallies varied by month and by facility. Inside Camp Hearn, the rules were strict but not arbitrary. Registered hours for work details, scheduled roll calls, and an official canteen where POWs could spend credits earned from labor. Rations were generous compared with what many in wartime Germany received. Camp documents note that daily food allocations often reached roughly 3,200 calories, a figure that would have seemed obscene to starving civilians across the Atlantic. The barracks were heated, the latrines functional, and medical care, in most cases, adequate. These logistical facts are not trivial. They shape the texture of daily life, and they undermined propaganda in ways that were subtle but cumulative. A man who slept in a straw-filled pallet and returned to a steaming bowl of stew at dawn could not help but notice the gap between the enemy and leaflets and the man who handed him a cup of coffee. Carl Weiss arrived at Camp Hearn in late 1943 as part of a shipment of prisoners captured in the Western Theater. He had been a front-line soldier, a man hardened by combat and conditioned by the language of the Reich. In the first months, he watched the camp closely, recording small discrepancies between what he had been taught to expect and what he found. He observed the disciplined laughter among guards, the clerks who kept careful logs of rations and hours, the young mothers in the town some miles away who looked no different from American wives and daughters everywhere. The men who processed the mail for the camp were conscientious. Letters came and went with a predictability that felt like a promise of order. For a soldier raised on the certainty of German superiority and the vilification of enemies, that sort of mundane civility was unsettling. Oberleutnant Franz Müller kept a sparse diary that year. His entries, short and careful, are often quoted by historians because they reveal a mind in transition. In one entry from the autumn of 1944, he jotted, "They feed us well. Their food is strange and good. Our papers say they are monsters. Our eyes say otherwise." The line is not triumphalist. It is a diarist's astonishment at a dissonance between ideology and experience. Private Franz Kessler, writing letters home, described soccer matches with guards in the afternoons and informal English lessons at the edge of the parade ground. These small scenes, the exchange of a cigarette, the rough passing of a ball, the patient repetition of a verb, did as much to reshape perception as any formal lecture. The camp was not a place of unalloyed benevolence. Security measures remained in place: towers, sentry rifles, and the psychological architecture of custody. The wire was both literal and symbolic. Yet within those limits, officials at Camp Hearn ran a program that aimed to reduce friction and keep prisoners productive. Many POWs worked on labor details, on nearby farms, in maintenance, and in food preparation. These tasks were regulated, paid modestly in canteen credits, and supervised by non-commissioned officers. Some of the laboring offered more than wages. It provided introduction to new forms of industrial organization and the possibility of mutual respect forged at the plane of work. Captain Jack Rowland presided over much of the daily organization. He was a Texan by temperament, blunt, practical, and inclined toward gestures that solved immediate problems. Major William Todd, who headed the district, favored policies that emphasized humane treatment as both obligation and strategy. He believed that treating prisoners decently served long-run military aims. It reduced escape attempts, lowered the administrative burden, and, not insignificantly, provided a living example of American values. These men were not naïves. They understood the broader war aim and the moral hazard in appearing to coddle an enemy. But they also knew the power of routine kindness to stabilize a volatile system. Not all soldiers at Camp Hearn shared that inclination. Some guards were wary. There were murmurs, dark jokes told in the barracks about fraternizing with the enemy, grumbles about security risks, and the occasional sharp rebuke when rules were pushed. Sergeant Billy Jenkins, a transfer from a different command, kept an easier rapport with many of the prisoners. Jenkins had the kind of face that suggested he had spent his young life outdoors. He smoked with the men at the end of a shift, passing a cigarette loosely between fingers of different uniforms. He was careful, too, about boundaries. Jenkins respected the line of duty, even while he softened its edges with honest conversation. Those conversations mattered. They turned ideology into person-to-person contact, and human contact can be corrosive to rigid dogma. A soldier who trades jokes with a guard in the late afternoon and hears a story about a family back home will begin, slowly, to reframe the enemy as a person rather than a caricature. By the winter of 1944, the year had been long and heavy with news from faraway fronts. Liberation of the death camps had not yet become the immediate public horror it would be in the months to come. Reports flowed inconsistently and often without the graphic clarity that would later define public understanding. At Camp Hearn, morale among prisoners varied. Some men were resigned and focused on getting through another year. Others held tight to national myths that had been cultivated for a decade. Into this mix came a modest plan, one that began as an ordinary matter of holiday logistics and, by serendipity and human choice, became a small experiment in reconciliation. It was Major Todd who first proposed that the camp put on a Christmas barbecue for the staff. The idea in itself was not revolutionary. The officers wanted to thank the cooks, the clerks, and the guards who kept the installation running. But as planning began, Todd suggested, with what some initially took to be rhetorical provocation, that prisoners might be included. He argued bluntly that a shared meal could reduce tension and that the security risk was minimal if handled with care. The suggestion struck a chord with a few officers, annoyed some, and made others laugh. "Invite them in?" one young lieutenant is said to have scoffed. "We don't invite them in." The debate that followed was practical rather than moralistic. How many extra plates would be needed? Where would the prisoners sit? Could traffic be controlled if 4,000 men tried to pass through the gate? Captain Rowland, who trusted common sense over ceremony, insisted on rules. Prisoners would be escorted in small groups, each under a few guards. They would be searched and their hands stamped. They would be allowed only limited movement within a cordoned-off area of the parade ground. Sergeant Jenkins negotiated the human details. He argued that if the men were to be included, they should not be herded like cattle. They should be given a place at tables, under lights, where conversation could happen in a manner that was both orderly and respectful. Supplies arrived in the days before December 24. Crates of coffee, bushels of potatoes, sacks of flour, and brisket cut for slow smoking. The cooks fired up pits of mesquite, the wood smoke smelling of the Southwest, in a way that was almost tangibly Texan. String lights were strung across the parade area. Men who had never seen such decoration in their hometowns paused to squint at the glimmer. The camp's canteen records show a spike in provisions that week. Not an extravagance, but a logistical rearrangement made to accommodate the event. Within the prisoner barracks, news of the planned barbecue spread like a rumor that could not decide whether to excite or alarm. Some prisoners, remembering the propagandistic descriptions of American wastefulness and cruelty, regarded the invitation with suspicion. Was it a trap? Would there be some humiliating spectacle? Others felt a hunger, not merely for food, but for what the food represented, an acknowledgement of their humanity. Private Franz Kessler captured that ambivalence in a letter sent home after Christmas. We were told to expect rations and roll calls. Instead, they lit a fire and played music. We did not trust it at first, but then the smoke smelled like something other than war. On the night itself, the camp hummed with a different rhythm. Guards walked with relaxed shoulders, cooks tended slow-burning pits, and the air thickened with heat and mesquite. When the first squad of prisoners was escorted through the gate, the movement felt to an observer like a rehearsal of civility. The men passed under floodlights, hands gloved against the cold, eyes wary. For some, the idea of stepping into an area that had been ours, the officers' end of the camp, was disorienting. For others, it was a relief. The gate closed behind them with a dull thunk that signaled containment as much as acceptance. The sensory detail of that night resists summary. The brisket hissed on the grill, meat juices spitting as fat hit hot metal. Mesquite smoke wound through the air in a ribbon, carrying a sweetness that cut through the bite of winter. String lights cast a warm, uneven glow, turning breath into ghostly halos and brightening faces shadowed by caps. The soundscape layered country guitar and harmonica with the low, multilingual murmur of conversation. German voices tentative and then growing bolder, English replies careful but open. Someone struck Silent Night in a harmonica's small, reedy key. The tune moved across languages with a familiarity that needed no translation. The harmonica, a small instrument, functioned that night like a bridge. Carl Weiss reached the serving line and took his first plate. There is a particular awkwardness to taking food from a hand you have been taught to hate. The exchange is both practical and symbolic. He chose a place at a long wooden table, sat beside an infantryman who had guarded a different block earlier in the week, and was offered a roll by a woman who had come to serve. The motion was ordinary and for Weiss dislocating. He had been steeped in story and slogan. Now he was listening to the rhythm of a story told in gestures. The handing over of bread, the shared laughter at a joke, the polite awkwardness when languages tangled. At one table, Sergeant Jenkins found himself across from a young corporal named Gunther Clean. Jenkins, who smoked a thin cigarette and had the casual confidence of a man used to fixing things, talked as he ate. The conversation began with names and hometowns, easy, neutral, then moved into safer ground, the weather, the merits of mesquite wood for smoking. As the cigarettes were passed, a currency that managed social exchange almost as well as bread, Jenkins broached a subject he had been curious about for some time: what the prisoners thought of news from home. Clean, quiet at first, answered with a guardedness that was both reflex and habit. Later, in an interview after the war, Corporal Clean would recall that the conversation had been like a small hammer, chipping away at a veneer of suspicion. Across the field, someone suggested a game. 2 rows of men, one American, one German, each trying to teach a chorus line a phrase of song. What began as lightness swelled into a stack of small performances. A harmonica player, perhaps a corporal off duty, played Silent Night again, and the tune spread. Voices rose, brittle at first, then smoother, and for a handful of measures, language fell away. In those measures, men sang syllables that sounded like home. The harmonica's wail threaded the melody through the crowd. Strangers found themselves marking the same beat. It is important to show, not merely to assert, the nature of the transformation that took place. The meal was not a scene from a movie where all animosities dissolve. There were pockets of discomfort, a man who could not forget the slogan in his head, a guard who refused to meet a prisoner's eye. At one table, a heated argument over soccer rules nearly escalated into insult. But these flashes of tension were contained. The overarching effect, sustained through the long night, was a lowering of defenses through routine human acts, eating, laughing, and sharing music. An episode during the barbecue exemplifies how ordinary practices reframed extraordinary circumstances. A child from the nearby town had wandered in, a gap in perimeter security that was by then hardly noticed. And when he reached a table, a prisoner handed him a piece of pastry with the unguarded affection of someone offering a favored neighbor a treat. The boy's cheeks, dimpled and clean, shone with sugar. A guard, watching, felt a tug in a place he had not known existed. The image, the boy, the pastry, the prisoner smiling, lodged itself in many memories from that night. It became a small emblem of the event's moral charge, the everyday offering of generosity under conditions that might easily have been cruel. When the barbecue wound down and the last plates were scraped clean, brief speeches were given. Major Todd thanked his men and the cooks. Captain Rowland made a terse joke about the efficiency of American barbecue. Then, before the prisoners were marched back through the gate, a captain rose and said in halting German what many Americans had not planned for: Frohe Weihnachten. The phrase, simple and seasonal, landed like a benediction. The prisoners stood, bowed their heads for a moment, and then filed back behind the wire, the gate closing with a dutiful finality. Yet the closing of the gate did not erase what had occurred beneath it. The aftermath of the barbecue unfolded in small but historically significant ways. Letters written by prisoners and carried home after the war contained lines that would later be read as counter-propaganda in Germany. Private Franz Kessler penned what amounted to a report of astonishment, that American staff had fed them well, that guards had sometimes been friends, that instruction in English had been offered as a kindness. Kessler's letter, short, factual, and incredulous, circulated among acquaintances and, in some instances, found its way into broader conversation that questioned wartime messaging. Captain Otto Kruger, who had been engaged at the front before his capture, penned a sober reflection as the Reich's downfall began to become undeniable in May 1945. Kruger's diary entry described not triumph but bewilderment. We were taught that our rulers stood above mercy, yet here were men who treated us as neighbors. The collapse of what we believed has left a hollow where certainty once stood. News of the liberation of concentration camps in Europe arrived with a staggered brutality that reframed everything. Prisoners at Camp Hearn, many of whom had been ignorant of the full extent of atrocities, received reports and testimonies that challenged their prior conceptions. For some, the discovery of what had happened in other parts of Europe provoked horror and shame. For others, it prompted denial. The kindness shown at Camp Hearn did not and could not erase the reality of mass murder. To suggest otherwise would be morally indefensible. Yet for many prisoners, the taste of humane treatment planted a seed of cognitive dissonance. If Americans could be courteous and decent, what did that imply about the ideological apparatus that had led them to war? That question did not have a single answer, and it yielded different responses among men of varying temperament and conviction. The long-term effects of experiences like the Camp Hearn barbecue are complex and uneven. Some men left the camps with a curiosity about democratic practices and a readiness to engage with new civic ideas. Corporal Gunther Klan, in a post-war interview, spoke about learning to like the ordinariness of American forms, the steady, bureaucratic efficiency of mail delivery, the small liberties of speech in the canteen, the humor exchanged without fear of reprisal. Others returned home to a fractured country, carrying shame, anger, or a hardened refusal to accept the new realities. History resists neat closure. What events like the Christmas Eve barbecue demonstrate is not a tidy conversion of hearts, but a scattering of new possibilities. A demonstration that simple acts, an invitation to a meal, a harmonica tune, a cigarette handed without scorn, can unsettle rigid narratives and open spaces where reconciliation, however partial, might begin. This is not to claim that hospitality alone transforms history. Structural power remained asymmetrical. The wire never disappeared. Legal authority, parole systems, and the fact of captivity kept an ethical imbalance in place. Even the most tender moment in the parade ground occurred under structures of control. The moral lesson, then, is both modest and large. Modest in that a meal cannot expunge systemic evil. Large in that abundance and dignity, when offered consistently, can be instruments of persuasion more effective than many coercive tactics. In the language favored by Major Todd, a confident generosity, assured in its own abundance, can be a moral force. The image that closes this episode returns to a quieter, colder visual. The barbed wire of Camp Hearn at dawn, gilded faintly by a Texas sun that carries no partisan allegiance. Beneath that wire lie memories, a harmonica's note still echoing in a man's head years later, a letter folded and sent across an ocean, an officer's choice to trust procedure and humanity at once. These are small things compared with the scale of destruction and suffering elsewhere in the war, and they should be held as precisely that, small but not insignificant. The Christmas barbecue at Camp Hearn remains in the archival record and in the diaries of men like Oberleutnant Franz Müller and Captain Otto Kruger, a shocking invitation, not because it solved the moral problems of war, but because it startled people out of the comfortable narratives they had been given. It offered an example of how ordinary decency, administered alongside discipline and caution, can teach by example. It produced letters that challenged propaganda at home. It gave men a taste of different possibilities of social life. And it complicated the simple story of enemy and friend. If one wonders whether such moments are exceptional or representative, the correct answer is measured. Exceptional in circumstance, illustrative in consequence. Camp Hearn's Christmas Eve was not the template for all POW camps. It was one instance where individual choices and sensible administration created a small opening. The larger war, with its machinery of atrocity, ideology, and violence, continued to unfold and to claim lives and consciences. Yet the story of the barbecue reminds us that history is also made in small gestures. A plate passed on a winter night, the hesitant harmonica rendering of Silent Night, the folding of a letter that would cross borders and, perhaps, seed new thoughts. Decades later, men who had been there would return to the memory not as a photograph of utopia, but as a recollection of a few hours when distance shortened and conversation could happen across an otherwise impenetrable divide. Captain Jack Rowland would recall the practical satisfaction of organizing a functioning event. Major William Todd would insist that policy and prudence governed his choice. Sergeant Billy Jenkins, more simply, would speak of the human pleasure of sharing a cigarette and a laugh. Carl Weiss, who stood under the floodlights that night and smelled mesquite smoke for the first time in captivity, carried the experience as one among many that complicated his sense of the world. He did not become an apologist for the regime that had once formed him. He became, instead, someone whose assumptions were unsettled and whose later reflections would testify to the power of ordinary humane treatment to alter a life in small ways. History rewards neither sentimentalizing nor erasure. It asks us to hold contradictions in balance, to recognize the horror that must be named, and to notice, without minimizing that horror, the moral consequences of concrete actions. The Texas barbecue at Camp Hearn is a case study in how abundance and dignity, offered within the structures of state power, can counteract hatred not by force, but by example. So ask yourself, looking at that image again, what does an enemy do when offered a seat at the table? He eats. He listens. He passes the salt. He sings, perhaps in a voice that surprises him. He writes a letter that will travel home and complicate simple speeches and slogans. He goes back through the gate and the wire is still there, but something inside him has shifted, irreversibly, in a small and human way. If this story moved you, consider leaving a note below about where you are watching from and sharing a memory of a small kindness that changed your view. And if you want to explore more episodes like this about POW life in America, about the logistics of camps, and about the letters and diaries that recorded these human moments, check the link in the description to a bibliography and a recommended next video. The barbecue at Camp Hearn did not end a war, but it did, for a few hours under string lights, demonstrate how dignity and abundance can become instruments of moral persuasion. That, perhaps, is the most unsettling invitation of all.